Think your winter gardening is tough? Viking farmers were growing food in climates so brutal that modern farmers would pack up and move south after one season. While we struggle to keep a few herbs alive on a windowsill, these Norse agricultural warriors were feeding entire settlements through 6-month winters where temperatures dropped to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Today, we're discovering 12 ingenious Viking farming techniques that turned the frozen wasteland of Scandinavia into thriving agricultural communities. Get ready to discover methods so effective that modern permaculture experts are rediscovering them 1,000 years later. The autumn soil breaking, Viking deep plowing before the freeze. Viking farmers knew that once the Scandinavian ground froze solid in October, it would stay that way until late April or May. Their solution was aggressive autumn plowing using the ard, a heavy wooden plow reinforced with iron that could break through the toughest Nordic soil. Unlike their southern neighbors who could work soil year-round, Vikings had a narrow window of opportunity that demanded perfect timing and relentless effort. The Viking ard was a masterpiece of medieval engineering, featuring a curved wooden beam pulled by teams of oxen or horses, with an iron-tipped share that could penetrate soil frozen just below the surface. Archaeological finds from settlements like Hedeby show these plows were built to last, with iron reinforcements that could handle the rocky, root-filled soil of Scandinavia. Modern soil science confirms what Vikings discovered through necessity. Breaking soil before winter freeze allows better water infiltration and root penetration come spring. The freeze-thaw cycle naturally breaks down large soil clumps through a process called frost weathering, creating perfect planting conditions without additional human labor. Studies of preserved Viking farmland show soil structure that remained optimal for planting even after centuries. Archaeological evidence from Viking settlements across Norway, Sweden, and Denmark shows plow marks preserved in frozen soil layers, proving they worked their fields until the very last possible moment before winter's grip took hold. Some sites show evidence of night plowing by torchlight, when early snows threatened to end the season prematurely. Viking farmers would joke that their plows had to be tougher than their battle axes. And considering these were the people who sailed to America in open boats, that's saying something about the durability of their agricultural tools. The Gokstad manure system. Viking waste management mastery. Vikings elevated animal waste management to an art form that would impress modern organic farmers and environmental scientists alike. They developed a sophisticated system called winter gold, collecting every scrap of manure from their livestock during the long indoor months and composting it with seaweed, fish scraps, kitchen waste, and even human waste in carefully managed ratios. This wasn't just practical recycling. It was a survival strategy that meant the difference between feast and famine. The high nitrogen seaweed available along Scandinavian coasts created compost so rich that Viking fields could produce abundant crops in soil that would challenge modern farmers equipped with synthetic fertilizers. The Viking composting process was remarkably sophisticated. Fresh manure was layered with dried seaweed, fish bones, ash from cooking fires, and organic kitchen scraps in stone-lined pits. The mixture was turned regularly using wooden forks, and the composting process was carefully monitored by experienced farmers who could judge readiness by smell, temperature, and appearance. Chemical analysis of preserved Viking-era soil from settlements in Iceland and Greenland shows nitrogen levels 300% higher than surrounding areas, with phosphorus and potassium levels that rival modern organic farms. This proves their waste management system worked incredibly well, creating soil fertility that sustained communities for generations. During winter months, when animals lived in attached barns for warmth and protection, Vikings collected manure daily and stored it in specially constructed pits lined with stones and sealed with clay. These storage systems prevented nutrient loss while allowing controlled decomposition that would be ready for spring application. Come spring thaw, this black gold was loaded onto sledges and spread thick across fields, creating the foundation for crops that could survive the short growing season and produce maximum yields in minimal time. Modern farmers pay premium prices for organic fertilizers that don't match the nutrient density Vikings created from their own waste streams and local resources. Raised bed mastery. The Viking hojbed system. Long before raised beds became trendy in modern permaculture and organic gardening, Vikings perfected the hojbed system, elevated growing areas that solved multiple problems inherent in their harsh climate. These weren't simple garden beds. They were sophisticated growing systems designed specifically for short summers, brutal winters, and the challenging drainage issues of Nordic landscapes. Viking raised beds were typically 3 to 4 feet wide and raised 12 to 18 inches above ground level, constructed with careful attention to drainage, soil composition, and heat retention. The beds were filled with layers of stones for drainage, composted seaweed and manure, imported soil, and organic matter in precise ratios that had been perfected over generations. The construction process began in late summer, when Vikings would gather stones from fields and shorelines to create the drainage layer. These stones weren't randomly placed. They were carefully sized and arranged to allow water flow while preventing soil loss. On top of the stone layer, they added coarse organic matter, like chopped seaweed and straw, followed by the precious composted manure mixture, and finally topped with the best available soil. This elevation provided crucial drainage during spring snowmelt, when lower areas would be waterlogged for weeks. The raised design also allowed soil to warm faster in the brief Nordic summer, giving Vikings a critical advantage in their race against the short growing season. Temperature measurements of reconstructed Viking raised beds show they warm up 2 to 3 weeks earlier than ground-level soil. Archaeological excavations at Viking settlements in Norway and Iceland reveal hojbed systems that remained productive for decades, with some showing continuous use for over 50 years. The elevated design allowed Vikings to start planting 2 to 3 weeks earlier than ground-level fields, a massive advantage when your entire growing season might only last 4 months. Modern Scandinavian farmers still use variations of this system, and permaculture experts worldwide have adopted Viking-inspired raised bed techniques. Studies show that properly constructed hojbed systems can increase crop yields by 40 to 60%, compared to traditional ground-level planting in northern climates. The Seaweed Secret. Viking Ocean Fertilizer Revolution. Vikings had access to something most medieval farmers could only dream of: unlimited seaweed from the North Atlantic and Baltic Sea. They developed harvesting and processing techniques that turned ocean plants into agricultural gold, creating fertilizer systems that modern organic farmers are rediscovering and trying to replicate today. Fresh seaweed was collected during winter storms when massive amounts washed ashore along the rocky Scandinavian coastline. Viking communities organized seaweed harvesting expeditions that involved entire families working together to gather, process, and transport this valuable resource. They developed specialized tools, including long-handled rakes and woven baskets designed specifically for seaweed collection. The harvested seaweed underwent different processing methods depending on its intended use. Some was dried and stored for later composting, while fresh seaweed was loaded onto sledges and transported directly to inland farms. Vikings understood that different types of seaweed had different properties: kelp for potassium, rockweed for trace minerals, and sea lettuce for quick-release nitrogen. Vikings would load sledges with this sea hay and transport it up to 20 miles inland to their farms, demonstrating just how valuable they considered this ocean resource. The seaweed was either composted with manure and other organic matter or applied directly to fields, where it slowly decomposed throughout the growing season, releasing nutrients exactly when plants needed them most. Modern analysis shows that Nordic seaweed contains over 60 trace minerals essential for plant growth, plus natural growth hormones called cytokinins that increase crop yields and improve plant resistance to cold stress. Viking fields treated with seaweed produced 40% more grain than those without it, while also producing crops with higher nutritional content. The salt content in seaweed also helped preserve soil structure during freeze-thaw cycles, preventing the soil erosion that plagued other medieval farming systems. This natural soil conditioning effect meant Viking fields maintained their fertility and structure year after year, even under harsh weather conditions. Some Viking communities developed seaweed processing techniques so advanced that they could create different fertilizer blends for different crops, essentially running medieval agricultural chemistry labs using nothing but ocean plants and practical experience passed down through generations. If you are enjoying Raiding the Past with us, then go ahead and pillage that like button and subscribe for more interesting journeys into the world of Midgard living. Wind fortress farming, Viking shelter systems. The howling winds of Scandinavia could destroy crops that might otherwise survive the cold, so Vikings became masters of agricultural wind management. They developed shelter systems called wind fortresses. Strategic arrangements of stone walls, planted hedgerows, and wooden barriers that created protected microclimates for their most important crops. These weren't random windbreaks thrown up to block harsh weather. They were carefully engineered systems based on deep understanding of wind patterns across Nordic landscapes. Vikings studied how wind moved across their terrain and positioned their main growing areas in natural hollows, then built curved stone walls that deflected harsh northern winds while channeling warmer southern breezes toward their crops. The construction of these wind fortress systems was a community effort that took place over several years. Stone walls were built using the dry stone technique, with carefully fitted rocks that could flex with ground movement while maintaining structural integrity. These walls were typically 4 to 6 feet high and built in curved or angled configurations that deflected wind rather than simply blocking it. The most sophisticated Viking farms featured multiple layers of wind protection, outer barriers of planted birch and willow trees that could bend without breaking, middle barriers of woven branch fencing that filtered wind while allowing air circulation, and inner barriers of stacked stone walls that created the final protected zone for the most valuable crops. Archaeological evidence from Viking settlements shows these wind management systems were planned and built with remarkable precision. Excavations reveal foundation stones positioned to create specific wind flow patterns, with some systems designed to create updrafts that carried warm air over crops during cold snaps. Modern wind tunnel studies of reconstructed Viking wind fortress systems show they could reduce wind speed by up to 70%, while raising air temperature by 5 to 8 degrees Fahrenheit, enough to extend the growing season by several crucial weeks in the short Nordic summer. This temperature difference could mean the difference between a successful harvest and crop failure. The systems were so effective that some Viking settlements could grow crops that shouldn't have been able to survive at their latitude, essentially creating artificial climate zones that allowed for more diverse food production than the natural environment would support. The Longhouse growing system, indoor Viking agriculture. While other medieval farmers struggled through winter with nothing but stored food, Vikings developed sophisticated indoor growing systems within their longhouses that provided fresh nutrition throughout the brutal Scandinavian winter. These weren't simple herb gardens on windowsills. They were integrated food production systems that could feed families for months. Viking longhouses were designed with growing areas built into the structure itself, demonstrating that food production was considered as important as shelter. South-facing sections featured raised growing beds positioned to capture maximum sunlight through strategically placed openings in the walls and roof. These openings could be covered with translucent materials, like scraped animal hide or thin sliced horn during the worst weather. The constant warmth from cooking fires, oil lamps, and body heat from humans and animals created perfect conditions for cold, hardy greens and herbs. The longhouse design naturally created temperature zones, with the warmest areas near the central hearth reserved for the most temperature-sensitive plants, while hardier crops grew in cooler sections. Archaeological evidence from Viking longhouses in Iceland and Greenland shows growing systems that could produce fresh food for 6 to 8 people throughout winter. Soil analysis from these indoor growing areas reveals high concentrations of organic matter and nutrients, indicating intensive cultivation and careful soil management. Vikings grew cold-tolerant varieties of kale, leeks, onions, and various herbs that provided essential vitamins when scurvy threatened other medieval populations. They also sprouted grains and legumes indoors, creating fresh greens that could be harvested weekly throughout the winter months. The most ingenious aspect was their use of night soil, human waste composted with ash and organic matter, to create rich, growing medium for indoor plants. This closed-loop system turned waste into food, demonstrating environmental sustainability principles that modern permaculture experts are still trying to perfect. Some longhouses featured sophisticated water management systems that collected and recycled water used for cooking and cleaning to irrigate the indoor growing areas. This water recycling meant that precious fresh water could serve multiple purposes before being used to nourish plants. Ice cellar. Preservation, Viking cold storage mastery. Vikings turned their brutal climate into an advantage by developing ice cellar systems that could preserve food for up to 18 months, longer than modern refrigeration in many cases, and with better nutritional retention. These weren't simple holes in the ground. They were sophisticated preservation systems that used natural ice and permafrost to create perfect storage conditions. Viking ice cellars were dug deep into hillsides and lined with stones to prevent collapse and maintain structural integrity through freeze-thaw cycles. The excavation process required careful planning, as the cellars had to be positioned to take advantage of natural drainage, while avoiding areas where groundwater might cause problems. During winter, Vikings would organize ice-cutting expeditions to frozen lakes and rivers, using specialized tools to cut uniform blocks of ice that could be efficiently packed into the storage chambers. The ice cutting was skilled work that required understanding of ice thickness, quality, and the best cutting techniques to create blocks that would last throughout the storage period. The storage chambers were packed with ice cut from frozen lakes and rivers, creating storage areas that stayed below freezing well into summer. Between the ice blocks, Vikings placed their preserved foods wrapped in seaweed, animal hides, or woven grass containers that provided additional protection while allowing air circulation. The system was so effective that Vikings could store not just meat and dairy products, but also root vegetables, grains, and even some fresh greens throughout winter. The constant cold temperature prevented spoilage, while the controlled humidity maintained food quality better than many modern preservation methods. Archaeological excavations have found Viking ice cellars that still contain perfectly preserved food after 1,000 years, testament to their preservation mastery and the effectiveness of their storage techniques. Some of these preserved foods have provided valuable information about Viking diet and agricultural practices. Modern food scientists studying Viking preservation techniques have found that their ice cellar systems maintained more nutrients in stored food than modern freezing methods, while preventing the cellular damage that reduces food quality in contemporary frozen foods. The slow, steady cold of natural ice preservation maintains food structure better than the rapid freezing used in modern systems. The Rune calendar growing system, Viking agricultural timing. Vikings developed one of the most sophisticated agricultural timing systems in medieval Europe, using runic calendars that tracked not just seasons, but optimal planting and harvesting times, based on centuries of accumulated weather knowledge and astronomical observations. These weren't superstitious practices, they were data-driven farming systems that maximized productivity in an unforgiving climate. The Viking runic calendar divided the year into specific agricultural periods, each marked with symbols indicating optimal activities for different crops and farming tasks. These calendars were carved in wood, bone, or stone and represented generations of accumulated knowledge about weather patterns, soil conditions, and plant behavior in Nordic climates. Modern analysis of these calendars shows they accurately predicted weather patterns and growing conditions with remarkable precision, often more accurately than contemporary weather forecasting. The calendars incorporated multiple environmental indicators, including ice breakup patterns, bird migration timing, specific star positions, and even the behavior of domestic animals. Vikings tracked the behavior of wild animals as indicators of weather changes and optimal farming times. They observed when certain birds returned from migration, when bears emerged from hibernation, and when fish began their spawning runs. All of these natural events were incorporated into their agricultural calendar system. The calendars also tracked lunar cycles and their relationship to plant growth, soil conditions, and weather patterns. Vikings understood that certain phases of the moon were better for planting, harvesting, or processing foods, and they incorporated this knowledge into their farming schedules. Archaeological evidence shows that Viking communities using Runic calendar systems consistently produced 25 to 30% more food than those relying on simple seasonal observations. The calendars were so valuable that they were carved in stone and passed down through generations, representing accumulated agricultural wisdom spanning centuries. Some runic calendars were so detailed that they included specific instructions for different soil types, elevation levels, and microclimates within a single farming area. This level of precision allowed Vikings to optimize their farming practices for the specific conditions of their individual farms. The terraced hill system, Viking slope agriculture. Vikings developed sophisticated terracing systems that allowed them to farm on steep hillsides that would be considered impossible to cultivate by modern standards. These terraced systems not only prevented soil erosion, but also created microclimates that extended the growing season and increased crop yields in challenging terrain. The construction of Viking terraces required enormous amounts of labor and careful planning. Stone retaining walls were built following the natural contours of hillsides, creating level planting areas that could be as small as a few square feet or as large as several acres. These walls were built using the dry stone technique, allowing for drainage while maintaining structural integrity. Behind each retaining wall, Vikings created growing areas filled with carefully layered soil, compost, and organic matter. The terraced design allowed them to capture and retain rainwater that would otherwise run off steep slopes, creating irrigation systems that required no additional water sources. The terraced hillsides created multiple microclimates within a single farming area. Lower terraces stayed warmer and had longer growing seasons, while upper terraces were cooler and better suited for crops that preferred cooler conditions. This allowed Vikings to grow a diverse range of crops within a relatively small area. Archaeological evidence from Viking settlements in Norway and Iceland shows terraced systems that remained productive for centuries. Some terraces show evidence of continuous use for over 300 years, demonstrating the long-term sustainability of Viking agricultural engineering. Modern studies of reconstructed Viking terraces show they can increase usable farmland by up to 300% on steep slopes, while reducing soil erosion by 90% compared to non-terraced hillside farming. The terraced design also creates natural windbreaks that protect crops from harsh weather, while capturing and retaining heat from sunlight. The fish fertilizer revolution, Viking aquatic agriculture. Vikings developed one of the most innovative fertilizer systems in medieval Europe by utilizing their abundant fish resources in ways that modern organic farmers are only beginning to understand. Living along coastlines rich with herring, cod, and other fish, Vikings created fertilization methods that turned fishing waste into agricultural gold. The process began with fish processing for food and trade. Every part of the fish that wasn't used for human consumption, heads, bones, scales, and internal organs, was carefully collected and processed into fertilizer. Vikings developed specialized techniques for fermenting fish waste that broke down the organic matter while preserving maximum nutrients. Fish heads and bones were buried in compost piles where they slowly decomposed, releasing phosphorus and calcium essential for strong plant growth. The fermented fish waste created a liquid fertilizer so potent that it had to be diluted before application to prevent burning plant roots. Archaeological soil samples from Viking farms show phosphorus levels that rival modern commercial fertilizers. Vikings also developed techniques for processing whole fish that were too small for food or had spoiled during storage. These fish were ground up and mixed with seaweed and manure to create a complete fertilizer that provided nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and trace minerals. The mixture was so effective that fields treated with fish fertilizer could produce crops in soil that was previously considered too poor for agriculture. The fish fertilizer system was particularly valuable for growing grains like barley and oats, which require high levels of phosphorus for proper seed development. Viking farms using fish fertilizer consistently produced grain yields 50% higher than those relying only on animal manure. Modern analysis shows that Viking fish fertilizer contained amino acids and growth hormones that not only fed plants, but also improved their resistance to cold stress and disease. This natural plant strengthening effect was crucial for crops that had to survive harsh Nordic conditions. The underground growing chambers, Viking root cellars as growing spaces. Vikings pioneered the use of underground chambers not just for storage, but as active growing spaces that could produce fresh food throughout winter. These underground growing chambers represented some of the most advanced agricultural engineering of the medieval period, creating controlled environments that allowed year-round food production. The chambers were dug into hillsides or constructed as stone-lined pits, covered with wooden roofs and insulated with turf. The underground location provided natural temperature control, staying warm enough for plant growth, while remaining cool enough to prevent overheating from decomposing organic matter. Vikings filled these chambers with carefully layered growing medium, consisting of composted fish waste, seaweed, manure, and soil. The decomposing organic matter generated heat that kept the growing environment at optimal temperatures for cold, hardy crops like leeks, onions, and various herbs. Ventilation systems made from hollow reeds or wooden tubes allowed air circulation while preventing heat loss. Some chambers featured sophisticated air management systems that could be adjusted based on outside temperature and growing conditions inside the chamber. The underground chambers were particularly valuable for growing medicinal herbs that were essential for treating illness during long winters when fresh plants weren't available. Archaeological evidence shows that some Viking settlements maintained underground herb gardens that could supply medicinal plants for communities of 50 to 100 people throughout winter. Modern reconstruction of Viking underground growing chambers shows they could maintain temperatures 20 to 30 degrees warmer than outside air while producing fresh food continuously for 6 to 8 months. This technology was so advanced that similar systems weren't developed elsewhere in Europe for several centuries. The seed preservation mastery, Viking genetic banking. Vikings developed seed preservation techniques that were so effective they could maintain viable seeds for up to 10 years, longer than many modern seed storage methods. This seed preservation mastery was crucial for survival in a climate where one bad growing season could mean starvation for entire communities. The process began with careful seed selection during harvest. Vikings chose seeds only from the strongest, most productive plants that had demonstrated ability to survive harsh conditions. This selective breeding over generations created crop varieties that were specifically adapted to Nordic climates. Seeds were dried using controlled methods that removed moisture without damaging the genetic material. Vikings built special drying chambers with adjustable ventilation that could maintain optimal humidity levels regardless of outside weather conditions. The drying process was carefully monitored by experienced seed keepers who could judge readiness by weight, appearance, and sound. Once properly dried, seeds were stored in specially prepared containers made from clay, wood, or woven materials that had been treated with natural preservatives. These containers were sealed with beeswax or pine resin to prevent moisture and pest infiltration while allowing minimal air exchange. The storage locations were chosen with scientific precision. Underground chambers maintained steady temperatures and humidity levels, while elevated storage areas prevented flooding and provided protection from rodents. Some Viking communities built dedicated seed storage buildings that served entire settlements. Vikings also developed seed testing methods to verify viability before planting season. They would test small samples of stored seeds by sprouting them indoors, allowing them to calculate germination rates and plan their planting accordingly. This testing prevented the disaster of planting dead seeds during the critical spring planting window. Archaeological evidence shows that Viking seed storage systems were so effective that some preserved seeds remained viable for centuries. Modern genetic analysis of these ancient seeds has provided valuable information about crop varieties that were lost to later agricultural changes. These 12 Viking farming techniques represent more than clever agricultural methods. They're proof that human ingenuity can thrive in the harshest conditions imaginable. What's remarkable is how accessible these techniques remain today. Modern homesteaders and farmers are rediscovering Viking methods like raised beds, seaweed fertilization, and wind protection systems with incredible success. Start with one or two techniques that match your climate and growing conditions. And if you have enjoyed Raiding the Past with us, then go ahead and pillage that like button and subscribe for more interesting journeys into the world of Midgard living.